3 men walked into Hitler's bunker and said the words that should have gotten them shot. "Leave Berlin now or you'll die here." April 22nd, 1945. Soviet tanks were in the streets above. The Third Reich had days left, and Hitler's top generals were begging him to run. But this wasn't about saving Germany. This was about saving themselves. What Hitler said back would doom hundreds of thousands in the next 10 days. April 16th, the Seelow Heights, the last barrier protecting Berlin. General Gerhard Heinrichi stood on these hills, knowing he was about to die. Across from him, 2.5 million Soviet soldiers with 6,000 tanks and 40,000 artillery guns. Behind him, 100,000 German troops, mostly teenagers and old men who'd never seen combat. They had nothing, no fuel, no air cover, no backup. At 3 a.m., the sky turned white when 143 searchlights lit up the darkness like artificial suns. The Germans couldn't see or aim, and through that blinding light came thousands of Soviet tanks. Then the artillery started, thousands of guns firing at once, turning the ground to craters while trees vanished and bunkers collapsed. The German teenagers fought anyway with single-shot rocket launchers. You had to let a tank get within 30 meters before firing. Most never got a second shot. They held for 3 days. Then the line broke. Soviet tanks poured through and raced toward Berlin. In his bunker, Hitler was still moving imaginary armies across his map, armies that didn't exist anymore. That's when the generals realized Hitler had no idea what was happening. He was living in a fantasy, and they were all going to die because of it, unless they did something they'd never done before: tell him the truth. April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday. Above ground, Berlin was burning. Below ground, they were having a birthday party. Hermann Göring was there, already planning to take over when Hitler died. Heinrich Himmler was secretly negotiating with the Americans. Joseph Goebbels was still writing speeches about final victory. And in the back, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and Colonel General Alfred Jodl, the 2 highest-ranking military officers, left. Göring suggested Hitler leave for Bavaria, and Himmler agreed, but Hitler said nothing. He just stared at his maps and talked about imaginary armies coming to save Berlin. That night, Göring and Himmler left. They knew it was over, but Keitel and Jodl stayed, not out of loyalty. They stayed knowing that whoever remained close to Hitler in his final days would shape how the collapse was remembered. They were already thinking about the trials to come. April 22nd, afternoon briefing. Soviet artillery was hitting central Berlin, the Brandenburg Gate, the parks where families used to walk, all of it on fire. Soviet scouts had reached the eastern suburbs. The city was about to be surrounded. Hitler demanded updates. Staff officers brought maps covered in red arrows, everyone pointing at Berlin. Hitler started giving orders. He ordered the 9th Army to attack, but the 9th Army was already destroyed. He ordered SS General Steiner to attack from the north, but Steiner's corps was just 3,000 exhausted men with no tanks and almost no bullets. The officers showed Hitler the truth. Steiner's attack never happened. The 9th Army was gone, and Berlin would be surrounded within hours. That's when Hitler lost it. He erupted in a furious outburst about betrayal, about cowards, about how the SS failed him, and the generals lied. The war was lost. First time anyone heard Hitler admit defeat out loud, then silence. Just generators humming and artillery getting closer. Keitel and Jodl left the room to make a decision. Hitler's plan to stay and die would trap hundreds of thousands. They'd all be killed or captured by the Soviets. Something had to be done, not to save Germany, but to save themselves. April 23rd, morning. Keitel and Jodl walked back in. They'd rehearsed every word. One wrong phrase and Hitler would have them shot. Keitel told him plainly that Berlin could not be held. Not surrender, just leave and relocate to Bavaria, where German forces still held territory, where the National Redoubt supposedly waited with its complex of mountain fortifications. The redoubt was a lie that Goebbels made up for propaganda, but in April 1945, myths were all anyone had left. Keitel laid it out. Berlin can't be defended. Soviet encirclement is hours away. The 9th Army can't break through, and General Wenck's 12th Army is too far and too weak. Staying means death. Hitler listened with shaking hands, staring past Keitel like he was seeing something no one else could. Keitel pushed, fly south to Berchtesgaden, leave Goebbels in charge of Berlin, and from Bavaria, coordinate the southern armies. Stay alive. Jodl added details, planes still available at Gottow airfield, or take a convoy southwest before the ring closes. Hitler could escape. Here's what no one talks about. Keitel and Jodl weren't trying to save Hitler. They were trying to save the command structure, keep something intact to surrender to the Allies. Keeping Hitler alive may have preserved leverage in negotiations with the Allies. They were already thinking ahead to what would come after the war. Hitler finally spoke. Not a quick answer, a monologue that went on for hours. He built the Nazi movement from nothing, broke the Versailles Treaty, conquered Austria, Czechoslovakia, France, Poland, launched the greatest campaign since Napoleon. If he runs now, history will call him a coward. If he stays, his death gives meaning to the soldiers dying outside. If he abandons Berlin, morale collapses. And then the fantasy. Maybe his presence will create a miracle. Maybe his will alone can still win this. He was completely detached from reality. Keitel tried again about the 12th Army linking up with Southern forces, preserving the command structure. Jodl offered, if you insist on staying, at least let the high command relocate. Hitler waved them off. I'm staying in Berlin. You can go if you want. Decision made. Keitel and Jodl could have defied him, forced him into a plane, walked away, and let him die alone. They did none of those things. They accepted his decision, saluted, and left. They'd spent 12 years obeying without question, executing criminal orders, building a system where disobedience meant death. They'd enabled every atrocity, and now, when it finally mattered, they couldn't break the pattern. April 23rd, Keitel and Jodl drove out of Berlin through rubble and corpses. In the bunker, Hitler planned his suicide. Above ground, the real war continued. In Berlin's streets, teenage boys and old men crouched behind barricades made from overturned trams and furniture. Most had trained for days. Some had never fired their weapons. They wore armbands, not uniforms. The Soviets would treat them as terrorists. Soviet tactics were simple. Blast buildings with artillery, send in tanks, infantry clears room by room, repeat. The Germans fought back. Soviet casualties would hit 300,000, but it didn't matter. For every Soviet killed, 10 more came. The Germans had no reserves, no reinforcements. When a block fell, it was gone forever. Propaganda loudspeakers blared, relief is coming, secret weapons are coming, the Führer will save us. But rumors spread faster. Hitler fled to Bavaria. Hitler is dead. Hitler is planning a breakout.
The sights and sounds of victory in Europe echo across the Atlantic and around the world.
April 25th, Soviet forces met west of Berlin and the city was surrounded. 300,000 German troops and civilians trapped inside. That same day, American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River. Germany was cut in half. The Third Reich, once stretching from Norway to North Africa, now existed only in scattered pockets that shrank every hour. April 30th, 1945, 3:30 p.m. Soviet troops were fighting a quarter mile from the bunker. The Reich Chancellery was under assault. Hitler and Eva Braun went into his private room. One gunshot. Hitler was dead. Gunshot to the right temple. Eva Braun beside him, killed by cyanide. Staff carried the bodies up to the Chancellery garden, put them in a crater, poured gasoline, set them on fire. The cremation didn't finish. There wasn't enough fuel or time. After an hour, they covered the charred remains with dirt and went back underground. May 2nd, General Helmuth Weidling surrendered to the Soviets.
Herr Littler, was geht hier eigentlich vor? Warum soll ich erschossen werden?
Sending 130,000 German soldiers into captivity. Over 100,000 civilians were dead, and a third of Berlin was destroyed. May 8th, 1945, 8 days after Hitler's death, Germany's unconditional surrender took effect. The war in Europe was over. Here's the irony. Hitler's refusal to escape might have saved lives. If he'd fled to Bavaria, he'd become a rallying point. Die-hard Nazis would have kept fighting in the mountains. The myth of the national redoubt would have inspired guerrilla warfare for months. When Hitler died, Admiral Dönitz took over with no interest in suicidal last stands. He sued for peace within a week. Had Hitler escaped and kept issuing orders, the war might have dragged into summer. More cities destroyed, died, more civilians killed, more soldiers dying for nothing. By staying in Berlin, Hitler centralized the collapse. When he died, the regime died with him. No fugitive legend, no shadowy figure hiding in South America. The conversations in that bunker revealed something darker than cowardice. Keitel and Jodl weren't heroes. They were men who'd spent 12 years enabling evil, executing criminal orders, building a system where obedience mattered more than morality. When they finally told Hitler the truth, that Berlin was lost, the armies destroyed, staying meant death, they did it to save themselves, not Germany. And when he refused, they accepted it because they'd trained themselves never to defy him. These weren't bad men who became good. These were professionals who subordinated everything, ethics, judgment, conscience, to loyalty and career advancement, who told themselves they were just following orders until the moment when truth mattered and they couldn't speak it because they'd spent too long staying silent. For the soldiers in Berlin's streets, Hitler's choice didn't matter. Whether he stayed or fled, they were dying either way. But for history, it mattered because it determined how we remember the Reich's end. By dying in Berlin, Hitler made his end absolute and undeniable. He eliminated himself from the equation and gave closure to a war that might have festered for months. The generals broke their silence too late. The truth they told came 12 years and millions of deaths after it could have changed anything. The lesson isn't just about Nazi Germany. It's about what happens when good people stay silent, when professionals value loyalty over principle, when following orders becomes more important than doing what's right. The generals who urged Hitler to escape weren't trying to save him. They were trying to save themselves. When he refused, they walked away and let hundreds of thousands die rather than defy the man they'd served. That's the real story. Not about bravery or tragedy, but about complicity and the price of silence. Hitler died in his bunker. The generals survived to stand trial. And Berlin burned because no one had the courage to act when it mattered. Remember that the next time someone tells you to just follow orders, remember what that cost.